let's start. So, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this South Pole Group webinar on green logistics. I'm very excited that such a diverse group of people has joined us today. So, we have attendees from Europe, from North America, and from very diverse backgrounds. So, logistics, manufacturers, academics, and consulting. So my name is Franka Bosman. I'm a key account manager at the South Pole Group, and I'll be guiding you through the webinar today, where we will be talking about reducing the carbon footprint of your value chain. So what will we talk about today exactly? So we'll focus on 4 key issues or topics. So first of all, what are key global trends related to both climate change and logistics? Secondly, various ways to reduce emissions from your operations. Thirdly, how compensating for unavoidable emissions works and how you, by doing so, can support the Sustainable Development Goals. And fourthly, how to set emission reduction targets that are meaningful and in line with climate science. So if you have any questions during the webinar, you can write them in the question panel. You can see this on your right, and we will be answering all your questions at the end of the webinar. So today you'll be hearing from me, Franka Bosman. I'm focusing on working together with companies from the travel and transport industries, and I'll be talking today about the global trends, strategies to lower your footprint, and CO2 compensation. I'm also very happy that Gabriella Norman from Bring Citymail is joining us from Sweden today. She has been with Bring for 15 years and is responsible for the sustainability management. And she'll be sharing with us how Bring Citymail became the world's first climate neutral postal service. And then also we have Franziska Sinner. She is South Pole Group's Head of Corporate Sustainability Advisory Services. And towards the end of the webinar, she will focus on explaining science-based targets. So before we dive into our 4 key topics, I would like to explain just on 2 slides who South Pole Group is and what we do. So who are we? South Pole Group is formed by 150 sustainability professionals, and we have offices around the world, which you see very nicely on this map here. And this puts us in a very good position to service our global client base. So 10 years ago, we started off as an emission reduction project developer, but over the years, we have broadened the universe of our services. So we are still the world's largest project developer, but also support companies in sourcing renewable energy. And in terms of green finance, we screen investments on their climate impact. And if we're looking at sustainability advisory, we're helping companies to improve their supply chain and identify risks, and also to do a greenhouse gas accounting in order to get transparency on the carbon footprint of a company and their products. So with all of our solutions, we strive to create a sustainable society and economy that positively impact our climate, ecosystem, and communities. So let's now move to our key topics and have a look at how the climate is actually impacting our ecosystems and communities today. So most of you, I would assume, have already first-hand experiences with the effects of climate change. And we know that we have limited time to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in our atmosphere. So transport plays a very big role here. Transport is responsible for about 1/4 of global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions and need to at least decrease by 50% within the next 30 years. So if we dive a bit deeper in this, we see that logistics or freight transport is, depending on the study, responsible for 7 to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And on top of this, this is expected to increase by a factor of 4 between 2010 and 2050. So this seems like a huge challenge, maybe almost a mission impossible, but is it? There is hope. So earlier this month, the Paris Agreement came to effect, and it was ratified by 114 countries as of today, responsible for almost 80% of total greenhouse gas emissions globally. And this should help to keep global temperature well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and actually pursuing to limit this to 1.5 degrees centigrade. So this goal is very ambitious, but there is criticism that the nationally determined contributions are actually too weak to achieve this goal. And moreover, that international aviation and shipping are not included. But also here there is good news since these sectors are moving. So in aviation, we've seen that in October, the CORSIA, the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, was agreed upon. And this agreement will enable carbon neutral growth from 2020 onwards and is one of the basket of measures that will help to halve emissions of what they were in 2005 by 2050. Also in shipping, we've seen that there's a EU regulation on monitoring, reporting, and verification of large ships that have to monitor and report on their CO2 emissions in all EEA ports as of 2018. Also in rail, we see that 28 members of the International Railway Union have committed to reduce their CO2 intensity by half by 2030 already. And of course, last but not least, also in the road transport, there are initiatives underway. So the EPA announced standards to improve fuel efficiency and reduce greenhouse gas emissions from trucks and buses. And also in the EU, a public consultation on the regulation on heavy-duty vehicle consumption and CO2 emissions was disclosed. So it's very exciting also to see how legislation will evolve within the next few months. So now let's have a look at the practical side. What are companies doing concretely already to reduce their emissions? So we see that companies are not sitting idle and are taking climate action ahead of regulation. Out of the 1,000 companies that report to the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, 85% of them have set emission reduction targets. And some of them have actually pledged to become carbon neutral. So here you see 4 examples of the many companies that have already done so. In addition, there are more than 80 global companies that have joined the RE100 initiative, pledging to source 100% renewable energy so they can reduce their emissions and decarbonize their value chain. So examples of these companies are IKEA, Interface, Johnson & Johnson, and Tetra Pak. Another trend that we see in the corporate world is that the environmental management and the carbon intensity is becoming more and more important when selecting partners. And also on the investment side, we see that big investors are moving away from carbon-intensive industries such as coal, oil, and gas. And a very good example of this is that the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund divested from coal-related investments about a year ago. And another trend related to investments is that we also see that investors are directing their investments towards best-in-class performance, meaning those companies that on one of the criteria have the lowest greenhouse gas intensity compared to their peers. So this already highlights that decarbonizing your value chain gives you a clear competitive advantage. And we also see that there are partnerships forming exactly to achieve this goal of reducing emissions. So 2 examples to highlight here are the SmartWay Transport Partnership, organized by the EPA in North America, and Green Freight Europe. So SmartWay already has more than 3,000 companies, and the Green Freight Europe about 1,800. So now we've seen what kind of trends are there on a global level, on a regulatory level, and on a corporate level. Let's get to you and let's discuss ways on how you can reduce emissions and what steps you can take to decarbonize. So a first step would actually be to reduce the amount of fuel, heating, or electricity that you're using. So you can do this by identifying efficiency gains within your value chain, and of course then implementing these measures. So I've highlighted A few of the quite well-known efficiency measures here. And some of them are, of course, more specific to your business than others. For example, route optimization is more complex and more business specific or specific to your business strategy and business model than retrofitting warehouses. But there is much information that can actually guide you in implementing these efficiency measures. And there's a lot of case studies on companies' websites, and it's as well a topic in partnerships as, for example, the Smart Way that I mentioned before. Excuse me. So the effects of all of these efficiency measures is to reduce the fuel or electricity use. But there are also possibilities to reduce emissions by switching the fuel type. And when talking about alternative fuels, switching to biofuels is the most time and cost efficient, since biofuels can be used for all types of transport and need little to no adaptation to current vehicles or aircraft that you're using. So biofuels broadly fall into two categories: first or generation or conventional biofuels, and second generation or advanced biofuels. And the former are a bit more controversial because they compete with food production and land use. And in general, a problem that we're seeing, so the focus is shifting more and more towards the second generation biofuels. However, here there's also problems with their supply, for example, due to lack of funding, political will, or available land. And as you can see in the graphs here, so the graphs are from the International Energy Agency and highlight the global production of biofuels in 2007 and project them into 2020. So what is very interesting here is the graph you see on the right that highlights that the global transport fuel demand, only 4% of that is projected to be met by biofuels within the next years. So this tells us that biofuels will definitely play a big role in the future, but for the short term, they will only add a small part to decarbonizing your value chain. So let's have a look and move on to another way to reduce your carbon emissions in relatively short term. So one way is to electrify your transport. So here we see quite a few trends. So in road transport, we see this a lot under postal service companies, that they're increasing the amount of hybrid vehicle and electric vehicles in their fleet. Two examples are the Austrian Post, who have already 1,300 electrical cars in use, and Deutsche Post, DHL, who have designed and produced its own electric delivery van, of which currently already 1,000 are being deployed. Now, of course, for air and sea freight, electrification is still a bit far in the future, but it should be mentioned that rail has actually been making a lot of progress, since electricity use has more than doubled since 1990. And in 2013, about 20% of the electricity use was from renewable resources. And this is a key point, because if the electricity used comes from a power grid that is mainly fueled by coal or other fossil fuels, emissions might actually be quite high. So I would like to exemplify this by giving you an example from a car. And this is also related to the graph that you see on the right that highlights the carbon emissions caused by an electric car, depending on the power grid per country. So if we take an example of a BMW 5 Series Touring, this, according to BMW, is emitting 140 grams of carbon dioxide per kilometer. If you compare this to an electric car in Spain, it would cause almost the same amount of carbon dioxide emissions. So the key takeaway here is that for your electric fleet or for your rail or electricity used by your offices, it is essential to use zero emission energy from renewable sources. So how to get this renewable energy and this zero emission electricity? So there are various solutions. You can produce this electricity by yourself, for example, by putting solar panels on your roofs. You can buy green energy from your provider. You can enter into a power purchase agreement. These are agreements that usually last between 15 and 13 years. So it could reduce risk, but is also a long-term commitment. And a more flexible alternative are renewable energy certificates. So renewable energy certificates, or also called RECs, represent the environmental attributes of 1 MWh of renewable energy that is produced. And RECs are traded as a commodity, and they have some benefits. So they're easy to get, and you have choice from which plant you want to buy this renewable energy. You do not need to switch suppliers, and you don't have a long-term commitment. And also at this moment, they're still quite cheap. Also, if additionality, so if new renewable energy is an important topic for you, there are certain eco labels that actually guarantee that the energy that is generated is additional. So we've looked at reducing your CO2 emissions by becoming more efficient, using biofuels, switching to electrification, and sourcing renewable energy. But this takes time. So until you have reduced your emissions to zero or very close to zero, you will still have an effect on the climate. And that is why another strategy to actually limit the impact you have on the climate is by compensating for unavoidable emissions. So you do this by matching the amount of emissions, usually expressed in equivalent of tons of carbon dioxide, by a similar or by the same amount of carbon credits. This, of course, means that 1 carbon credit represents 1 ton of CO2 that was reduced or avoided somewhere else. And carbon credits come from emission reduction projects. Mostly they take place in developing countries, and they rely on carbon finance. This means that without the finance from the sale of carbon credits, these projects that promote renewable energy or energy efficiency would not have been possible. So carbon credits are guaranteed additional. This already sounds a bit technical, but it's a very important point. So let's dive a little bit more into how compensating for your CO2 emissions work and what the benefits are. So many logistics companies already map their footprint and offer their customers carbon calculators. I've seen many really good tools on some of your websites, but there are also companies that have gone a step further and compensate for their unavoidable emissions and offer even carbon neutral services. They do this whilst reducing their emissions. So all of the companies that you see here below are offering carbon neutral services. Some of them offer it as an optional service that clients can pay for, and others have actually integrated the service into their offering and take responsibility for all emissions costs from their value chain. So how this is usually done is by purchasing carbon credits. However, you see also some examples of railway companies here, and they have another alternative. So how they can offer carbon neutral services is also by purchasing renewable energy. For example, as mentioned before, by a green tariff or by purchasing RECs. So if you wish to offer your clients a carbon neutral service, we would recommend 4 steps that are crucial in this process. So first of all, it's about creating transparency, actually calculating how many emissions you are responsible for. Secondly, decide on your approach. What do you want to compensate for? Thirdly, selecting the projects. It's important to support projects that make a difference to you and your customers. And fourthly, communicate. So let's have a look at the first step, creating transparency. So this is all about expressing the greenhouse gas emissions that are generated by your operations in tons of CO2 equivalent, which yields your carbon footprint. So this footprint is not only the baseline for calculating how many carbon credits have to be purchased, but it also gives you very valuable insights into the most, let's say, polluting parts of your value chain, and also help to identify improvement potential here. So once you have your footprint, there are many tools and frameworks, as well as supportive consultants that you can use. I've listed a few good tools and frameworks here. So for postal service companies, UPU has made available a free tool that's called Oscar. You see an illustration of that here, where you can calculate all 6 greenhouse gas emissions and convert it into a carbon footprint. South Pole Group is one of the providers of footprinting services, and we also offer a tool to actually automate the calculations. And this is all in line with the GLAC framework for logistics, emissions, and methodologies. So once you have a footprint, you move on to the next step, which is deciding on your approach. So if you want to offer carbon neutral services or products, you have generally 2 options. One is to make it optional for your clients. So your customers have to pay for compensating the emissions only from the transport of their goods. Or B, you actually take responsibility for all emissions cost and really integrate it into your offering. And then there's another choice to make that I want to highlight. So when we're talking about carbon neutrality, we're talking about compensating for the CO2 emissions that are the biggest part of the greenhouse gas emissions cost. We can talk about climate neutrality, where actually all 6 of the greenhouse gases emissions are compensated for. So once you have decided on this, you move on to actually selecting from which project you want to purchase carbon credits of. This is important because it's really an investment in a project that has a real impact on local lives there. So an example you see here is from a Falafrica project. And when selecting your project, there are multiple items to take into account, but I would like to highlight 3, namely the standard, the type, and kind of additional benefits that often link to the Sustainable Development Goals. So let's have a look at the standards first. So the 4 standards shown here are used in the voluntary market, where companies and private persons compensate on a voluntary basis. And this is in contrast with emission reduction projects that originated on the compliance markets in so-called cap and trade schemes. So the most well-known of a type of market is the European Union Emission Trading Scheme, the EU ETS. And here projects from the Clean Development Mechanism are used with the CDM standard. So you can forget about all that, and let's focus on the voluntary carbon standards. So the most widely used ones is the VCS standard. We see that in about half of all the carbon credits that are purchased on the voluntary market have the VCS standard. And VCS is often combined with the 2 standards you see below. So CCP, that's highlighting very strong biodiversity benefits, or social carbon, which the name already says it, highlights strong social benefits. Now, the gold standard was initially developed for the compliance market and highlights also very strong socio-economic benefits. Gold standard projects are also available on the voluntary market and have a premium status. So let's move on now to the types of projects that there are. So I've listed a few project technologies here on the right. This is a non-exhaustive list that can generally be grouped in renewable energy or energy efficiency. And depending on the type of project, so the technology used, so to say, and also the country where the project takes place, there is a very strong effect on what kind of additional social and economic benefits are produced by the project. So let's have a look at some of these benefits and how they link to the Sustainable Development Goals. So I've listed 10 of the Sustainable Development Goals here and put next to them a few of the outcomes from the emission reduction projects. So the first, for example, no poverty, is supported by generating additional income, for example, when farmers can sell their agricultural waste to a biomass plant. So something that, let's say if it's waste from cotton that used to be just burned in the field before, they can now actually sell it, so get additional income from this. To make this a bit more concrete and a bit more To illustrate this, I would like to give you 2 examples of projects and how they link to Sustainable Development Goals. So the first example I would like to share with you is the Kariba Red Plus project that's taking place in Zimbabwe. So here, this project is about forest protection, and therefore, of course, since trees our function as carbon sinks, is supporting Sustainable Development Goal 13 and 15, but also it's creating sustainable jobs. So people have a stable income from the sale of honey, for example, so supporting Sustainable Development Goal number 1, and they're also trained. So this is supporting goal number 4. And also, I should not forget, many school subsidies were provided. So there's a large spillover of positive benefits from this project. So if these are, for example, if these Sustainable Development Goals are already part of your strategy, this could be a reason why to choose a project like this to support. Another example is the Mali Cookstove project. Here you see a lot of Sustainable Development Goals mentioned that are supported thanks to this project. I will not go into all of them, but what we see a lot is that this is really a defining factor for companies to choose their project. So the link with Sustainable Development Goals, also the country where the project takes place, and also the type of projects. So here, efficient cook stoves, it's a very beautiful way on how to create clean and renewable energy, save time, improve health, and also create jobs. So the last step, and I wouldn't say the most important one, but a very crucial one, is actually on how to communicate about your carbon neutral services. So to make most of your CO2 compensation strategy, you have to market it effectively to external and internal stakeholders. So a very strong action you can take is actually to involve your customers and or employees to vote for the project. So you can make a pre-selection and enable voting on your website. What we also see a lot that's very effective if you create a brand for your initiative. Images, actions speak louder than words, but images do so as well, especially with some of the examples you see here, they really convey a strong message. Some good practice that we've seen as well is if you have an optional carbon neutral service, is to actually acknowledge your customers' engagements. So thank them, for example, with a certificate once every year. Also, we would advise and can also support in preparing a Q&A, since for some people, compensating for carbon emissions is quite a complex topic. So this is good to answer most of the common questions. And we've also seen that it's good practice and gives a very positive effect if you highlight the initiative in your sustainability report. Good, that was all so far from me. Now I'm very pleased to hand over to Gabriela Norman, who will give you a best practice example of Bring Citymail, who was the first company to actually offer climate neutral postal services. Gabriela, over to you.
Thank you, Franca. Really happy to be part of this webinar and to tell you a little bit about how Bring Citymail works with these questions. Bring Citymail is a postal company, and our services focus on delivering mail and small packages. Our customers include numerous companies of varying sizes from different market sectors, as well as official authorities and non-governmental organizations, etc. Our former CEO was invited to speak at the UN in New York by Ban Ki-moon, and forwarding Bring Citymail as an example of how relatively small companies taking active decisions can make a difference. We are part of the United Nations Global Compact, an initiative to encourage businesses worldwide to adopt sustainable and socially responsible policies and to report on their implementation. The UN Global Compact is a principle-based framework for businesses, stating 10 principles in the areas of human rights, labor, the environment, and anti-corruption. Bring Citymail, sorry, I was a bit too fast there. Bring Citymail services and are entirely climate neutral since 2008. This means we are compensating for CO2 emissions from operations, offices, and fuel. Our climate compensation covers both our own emissions as well as the emissions of our bought transports, for example, carrier. This means climate neutral distribution is already part of our services offered to all clients and not an extra charge. And the decision to include climate neutrality in our services was triggered by demand, so to speak. The environmental issues were increasingly becoming a hot topic, and we saw an opportunity to get a head start and offer something our competitors couldn't. And the reaction was and is, I think, positive. This has now become to some extent something that customers take for granted, so-called hygiene factor. And we should, though, work harder on informing our employees about what we do and the extent of our commitment and goals in this area. We use our climate neutrality as an important advantage in sales meetings with customers, both present and future, also as a way to strengthen our employer branding, and of course a way to take responsibility for our part in the global climate issues at hand. But not only do we compensate for, but we have also been continuously reducing our emissions. We strive to act as responsible as possible regarding environmental issues. Our greatest challenge is to manage our growth and in the process obtain a good balance between environmental goals and economical targets. We have mainly reduced our carbon footprint through reducing our fuel consumption by 22,000 liters in 2014 and 2015. In 2013, it was 13,000 liters. Also training in total 800 of our drivers in eco-driving since 2011. Setting a target of Euroclass 5, 85% or higher for subcontractor transports. And in 2015, we obtained 91%. Cooperative distribution of mail services, looking for sustainable synergies, venues, routes, vehicles, etc. Also a policy for several years that all company cars meet the requirements of maximum 120 grams CO2 emissions per kilometers. And regarding our distribution fleet, we use the best car model available on the market in the transportation segment for postal services for minimal emissions, 119 grams CO2 per kilometer. In the exchange program for our distribution fleet, all new vehicles since 3 years and onward are also HVO compatible. HVO, or hydrogenated vegetable oil, biodiesel, is produced by hydrogenation, hydrogen treatment of vegetable oils and or animal fats, such as offal. HVO is chemically similar to fossil diesel and can be blended with diesel or used in place of diesel fuel in diesel engines. Sweden has yet to expand the number of HVO stations on a larger scale. Focus and follow up on our company travel policy is also part of this. Mainly, we need to reduce flights. Our goal is to obtain a reduction of our total carbon emissions in relation to our revenues. And our emissions have been reduced between 2014 and 2015 at 1.1 ton CO2 per million kronas revenue. Trying to find the next slide. I'm sorry, the arrows are not working with me. So, finally, LifeStraw, our climate compensation project. Upholding and improving our climate neutrality is something we should mainly achieve by refining our own processes and work methods, as well as through close-knit cooperation with our subcontractors. And the goal here is, of course, to work as well and efficiently as possible, thereby minimizing the cost for climate compensation. Until this is a reality, we compensate through CDM projects. Bring Citymail initially supported a water project in India, but in 2011 we switched and opted for a more innovative project that did not only provide for clean water, but also had strong social benefits. The LifeStraw incorporates a technique that is highly efficient while low in energy consumption, which has a positive impact on the environment. The technique even results in improved water quality compared to traditional methods of purification, as much as 99.9% of all bacteria, etc., is eliminated. Live straw also has several positive social effects. Children complete their education, employment opportunities are created, and it is time-saving for families in their daily life. So in total, the positive consequences aid people in their efforts to escape poverty. At present, Bring Citymail's annual investment in order to achieve climate neutrality in the company budget is around 650,000 Swedish kronas, which equals approximately 66,000 euros or $70,500. As mentioned before, this compensation covers both our own emissions as well as the emissions of our boat transports. And our belief is that this is a small price to pay if you consider the benefits, both internally and externally in terms of business opportunities, credibility, and respect, while also taking active responsibility for a sustainable future. So I thank you all for your attention. You will have the opportunity to ask any questions you might have later. And on that note, I now turn the continued presentation over to Franziska.
Thank you, Gabriela. And I will continue to talk about science-based targets. As Franca had already mentioned and introduced the 2-degree target, she mentioned that scientists, global policy leaders, and countries agreed that we have to limit global temperature increase to not more than 2 degrees to avert the worst consequences of climate change, but also to still guarantee something like economic feasibility and cost efficiency. So within those climate negotiations and global climate policy talks, the Paris Agreement and also the recent conference in Marrakesh, 2 questions always come up, which are basically how to set respective concrete and comparable targets to meet that 2-degree goal. And the second question is how to also include private sectors, companies, investors in this. So both of these questions basically aim for something like a consistent approach to ensure that we link actions and targets for all stakeholders and are in line with those 2-degree, this 2-degree target. In this discussion, always it comes up one term, science-based targets. And that is what I will be talking about for the next 5 or 6 slides. Science-based targets are, hence, carbon reduction targets which are aligned with scientifically proven scenarios with the 2-degree low carbon economy pathway, basically. And the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, which is basically something like the scientific arm of the UN, they have outlined very specifically how a 2-degree scenario would look like and how emissions would have to develop, even at sector level, to reach that goal. Hence, science-based targets would be in line with these outlined scenarios. And that's the basic idea of science-based targets, to be in line with that 2-degree target. In order to implement this concept or the idea of a 2-degree and a science-based target, there has been formed an initiative by the CDP, the UN Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, and the WWF, especially targeting corporates and private sector clients to really translate the idea of science-based targets into the corporate world. The aim of that initiative is to help companies determine how much they must cut emissions to prevent the worst of the impacts of climate change and to reach the 2-degree goal. The initiative has been formed in 2015. It started with a call for actions to ask corporates to demonstrate leadership and to commit to a science-based target. So far, 174 corporates have signed up with this commitment. And what it means to sign up
is basically only signing a letter saying, yes, we believe in something like science-based targets, and we want to make an effort to design and agree upon a science-based target for our corporate. The letter commits to an implementation plan of 24 months. So within 2 years, the corporate should then really go into details and come up with a target which is in line with the 2 degrees and the science-based targets. So that commitment has been done by 174 companies. There's also 26 companies, as you see here on this slide on the left-hand side, which actually have not only just signed the letter, but also really committed to a target. And the target was approved by the Science-Based Initiative already. So those companies, those 26, have gone a step further and really published their science-based target. And that is also the goal of the Science-Based Initiative. So when you signed the letter, you have 24 months, and then you come up with your real goal. The initiative has an overall goal to reach 250 sign-ups by the year 2018. Now they have 26 plus 174, so 200. So they will probably most likely reach this goal. I wanted to share one specific example from the transportation sector. As you see on the slide already, there is a couple of transportation sector clients who have signed up with the science-based targets. However, there is one I wanted to go into detail with, and that is Thalys, the train operator. I think it's Belgian, Dutch, German, French together. They committed to a science-based target and reducing carbon emissions per passenger kilometer by 41.4% by 2020. They describe the motivation of this goal by 2 main reasons. Basically, they want to be a front runner. They want to be a leader in sustainability and demonstrate that it's possible. They also clearly see an advantage by attracting more customers. And those 2 reasons made them to really commit and make this public and communicate well about it on their website. When you go there and you book a ticket, you already get a carbon calculator. You see how much you save when you do buy a train ticket compared to other transportation modes. So they do the communication part pretty well. However, what I also want to illustrate here is that they don't only use this as a communicational tool and also just as attracting more customers, but they also see science-based targets as something they have to integrate into their business, and they do that actually pretty well. They have broken down the overall target and applied it bottom up to different departments. Each department has a goal. They have created KPIs, so they really link everything to major business objectives, and that I think makes them pretty unique and also shows that they have identified climate change as a risk for their business, and they're really integrating it into all their business operations, into their strategy and into their future thinking to gain a competitive advantage, but also to survive in the future. So from this good example, I thought I'll also go into the question, so if you now want to commit to a science-based target, but you have not really started yet, what would be the next steps? So for that, there is a couple of requirements by the Science-Based Targets Initiative. If you want to go through that initiative and sign that letter, as I mentioned, you have 24 months to design your science-based target. For that, what you would need first is, of course, your carbon footprint of your operations. So you will have to determine scope 1 and scope 2, your direct and your indirect emissions from energy purchases. You have to quantify those, and you also have to screen your scope 3 emissions. Those are your indirect emissions of the upstream and downstream activities. And the Science-Based Target Initiative says if your scope 3 emissions are material, that means if they are more than 40% of your total, you have to include them in your goals. So that's kind of the threshold. So you do your footprint, you know what your current greenhouse gas emissions are, and then you would forecast those in a kind of a business as usual scenario if your business continues into the future, and you have kind of your own business as usual scenario for emissions. And this one you would have to compare to a science based scenario, or one of the scenarios of the IPCC, or there is several options, several methodologies. The science-based initiatives suggest what you should do. There is a good guidance. So basically, you compare your emission scenario versus a line 2-degree scenario, and then you would know how much you would have to reduce, and you agree to a goal in a certain time frame. The requirement is that time frame has to be at least 5 years. So you cannot just do it for the next year. And another requirement by the Science-Based Target Initiative is that you have to make everything public at the end. So you report on it and you communicate on it. One thing I wanted to mention is since the Science-Based Targets Initiative really aims for long-term achievement of the 2-degree goal, and it isn't only looking for the next 2 years, that long-term vision and goal also means that for the Science-Based Initiative, at the end, when you want to reach your goal, you cannot really use offsets. You need to reach your goal through actions. However, the Science-Based Initiative also agrees and acknowledges that carbon offsets are a medium-term solution to move towards full sustainability. And I mean, we all aware of that greenhouse gas mitigation can only take place through the combination of various actions. For the transportation sector, that variation consists of different measures within energy efficiency, fuel switching, innovative new technologies versus electrification, maybe renewable energies in the electrification, optimized logistics. So there is a lot of options. However, offsets are also a part of it, can be used as a medium-term solution to really reach your goals. From that, I'm moving forward to the final slide. Why would you actually commit to science-based targets, and why are people doing this? This is basically, as I already mentioned, first of all, to demonstrate sustainability leadership as a company. That was the main motivation by Thalys as well. But it's also a little bit more. It's about building credibility and reputation with your stakeholders, and mainly with your clients and customers. It's also securing long-term competitive advantage. It's attracting investors and securing financial returns. South Pole works a lot with investors, and we see that is a demand by investors to look into the carbon footprints of their assets they invest in. So there you would definitely attract investors in that direction. It's also because you want to drive innovation, you want to be part of the leaders and not being part of the laggers. You protect your future business model as well of your profitability. And I think finally what I would want to emphasize on is that science-based targets are not only an initiative for communication, looking good and committing something. It's really what Thalys is doing. It's about integrating it into your business, realizing risks, and ultimately it's aiming for really understanding climate risks and how they can impact your future business activities. So with that, I'm passing over to Franka. She will do a conclusion, and then we get to further questions if you have any. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Franziska, for that excellent explanation of what science-based targets are about and what advantages it could bring for a logistics company. So it's already time for our conclusion. The first conclusion would be that there is global momentum to take climate action. And you, as a logistics company, have a big role to play in this. We see that logistics is growing, but with that also the the need to reduce your emissions, that there's high demands from customers, investors, and also sometimes from employees. We've seen that there are various ways how you can actually reduce your emissions, how you can decarbonize your value chain. We've seen some examples of how you can implement efficiency measures, how you can reduce your fuel or electricity consumption, how you can switch to biofuels or electrified means of transport, how you can use renewable energy, for example, by producing your own electricity or buying renewable energy certificates, and how you can also compensate for unavoidable emissions, for example, those that are emitted from fuel use. We've also talked about offering your clients a carbon neutral service to demonstrate your leadership and to also compensate for the emissions, and at the same time support sustainable development goals. Now, the last topic that we discussed were setting science-based targets. We talked that this is essential to make actually sure that your targets are ambitious enough to keep actually the promise of the Paris Agreement. So to keep global warming well below 2 degrees centigrade and actually enable a sustainable future for us all. So with all of these actions that you can take to decarbonize your carbon footprint, South Pole Group can help. And would love to hear from you. Also, if you have any questions later on that we'll not discuss right now in the Q&A. So here are contact details. Would love to hear from you. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention and switch to the Q&A session. We've received some questions. The first one is if we get the presentation. Yes, we will send a presentation within a few days after the end of the webinar, and we'll also put a recording of this webinar online. The second one is we are a road transport company that will start calculating to be able to reduce and compensate. Is there any learning tool available to do a correct job in this? All right, well, that is great. I think for this question, I'll hand over to Franziska. Franziska?
Sure, thanks, Franca. Yes, so there's 3 elements: calculation, reduction, and compensation, as I understood in this question. I'll go step by step. Calculating, there is plenty of tools out there online. There's calculators online which can be used. However, I just want to mention calculation of footprints are basically based on a methodology and approach by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. That is the common standard to use. It's by the World Resource Institute. You can download it on their website and read. They give a lot of guidance as well, calculation tools also, I think, for the road transportation sector. So you type in your kilometers driven and so on, and then you calculate your CO2 emissions according to their standard. So that is on the calculations. With regard to reductions, there is not really a standard or a preferred way to do it. You would identify that according to your operational conditions. Usually you take the cost efficient measures first. Maybe there is low hanging fruits and something which even saves you cost. And then you really assess what you have as options and decide and prioritize which ones you would implement first. South Pole can help you with that. South Pole can also help you with the calculation and applying the Greenhouse Gas Protocol correctly. And thirdly, with compensation, there is, again, online tools available to type in your carbon footprint or your amount you want to offset or compensate, and then you basically pay, you choose the project, and you get the certificate of the amount you offset. South Pole offers this kind of calculator or web shop on their website. You can also get in contact with us directly. You can explore in the web. There's other providers, so there's a lot of options. Please let us know if this answers your question, or if you have more questions, just send us an email. Thanks so much. And then, Franca, do we have additional questions?
Yes, thanks, Franziska. I have one more question. I think it's for Gabriela, or I'm quite sure. So the question is, Bring started in 2008. What has been the effect on other companies? So I think the question here is, Gabriela, how have other companies been inspired by you? Have you, shared best practice? Maybe you can also tell a little bit about how employees reacted or clients.
Yes, I'm not sure if I can say that we have inspired other companies, but I can say that this is a vital part of our communication with our customers, and that they are very much interested in getting reports on how much emissions their transports cause. So regularly we get requests to supply them with reports regarding that. Also, I've been invited to an event with customers to talk about the work we do and Lystro as a project and how we work reducing emissions and trying to make an impact on the global climate questions, actually. Also, we should do a better job of informing our employees, telling them about exactly what we do and what our goals are. I think we can improve on that part, but of course, when and if we get the opportunity to communicate, I always get a positive response in that regard. So all in all, I think there is all to gain and nothing to lose by entering into this project.
Great. Well, that's a beautiful ending. I think, so thanks very much, Gabriela. I think that was a perfect wrap up. I see that at this point we have no further questions. So again, I'd warmly invite you to, if you have any questions afterwards, if you look through the slides and something is not clear or you would actually like to take action, to reach out to us. We'll look very much forward to that. And then at this point, I would like to thank you very much for your time and your interest. And we look very much forward to hearing from you. And then I wish you a very good rest of the day, be it either evening or morning. And thanks again, and hope to hear from you soon.